In the endless dust of the desert, one woman's life of silence is interrupted by unexpected visitors. Their presence challenges her solitude, testing the boundaries of trust and the possibility of human connection. Watch as a single choice could change her life forever. Subscribe and like to follow her journey. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of ochre dust and cracked earth that reflected the burning sun in waves of shimmering heat. Mara Calloway had chosen this forsaken spot for a reason here. The silence was absolute, unbroken. By towns or traveling wagons, by the whispers of men or the laughter of children. She had built her small shack with her own hands, stacking each board and hammering each nail in a ritual that kept her grounded against the chaos of the world she had left behind. Her life consisted of little else but survival, tending to a tiny water cistern, sweeping dust that accumulated faster than she could chase it, and stacking firewood with meticulous care for the coming cold nights. For years she had seen no one. She had grown used to the wind as her only companion, the only one to sweep through the open plains with her. And then, in the late afternoon, when the sun had begun its descent and the horizon glowed like molten copper, a sound reached her ears' hooves against the hardpan earth. At first, she thought it was a mirage of heat, a trick of her eyes, but soon the sound grew louder, deliberate, steady. From the wavering horizon emerged 5 riders, spaced apart, their dust-caked horses moving with measured care, as if they too had felt the weight of the silence surrounding the shack. Mara felt a tightening in her chest, a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. She stepped back from the doorway, hand hovering near the leather strap of her satchel, eyes scanning the approaching figures. The tallest man, riding slightly ahead of the others, reined in a few yards from the shack, his face set and eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but deliberate, carrying across the still air. "We mean no harm. We've been riding hard and could use some firewood. Nights out here get unforgiving." Mara studied him in silence, noting the careful tilt of his head, the subtle tension in the way he held his reins. She hesitated, weighing the risk. Offering firewood could be harmless, or it could be a mistake she would regret. Her attention shifted to the rider at the back, a young man whose eyes lingered on her with an intensity that was unsettling, almost intimate. Unlike the others, he did not survey the land or the trail. He only watched her. Then, almost shyly, he spoke, voice barely audible above the whisper of wind. "Maybe, if you allow it, I could stay a while." Mara's heart skipped. The stillness she had cherished for years, the dust and silence that had been her shield, seemed suddenly fragile. For the first time, she felt the weight of other lives intersecting with her own, bringing with them uncertainty, danger, and perhaps something she had thought lost forever. "Do you think the young man can be trusted? Or is there danger hidden in his request?" The sun dipped lower, burning the edges of the horizon into fire, and Mara's world seemed to shrink to the space between her shack and the approaching riders. The tallest man, whose presence carried authority without arrogance, carefully laid bundles of firewood near the porch. Each movement was deliberate, measured, respectful of the fragile silence she had maintained for years. She watched him, noting the subtle way his eyes scanned the empty land, as though calculating how far the nearest threat might be. Behind him, 2 other riders moved with quiet efficiency, their hands steady as they stacked wood, boots crunching against dry soil. The youngest, the one whose voice had whispered a tentative request to stay, lingered slightly apart. He didn't touch the firewood, didn't adjust a horse or saddle. Instead, he studied her with a patient intensity that unsettled her, his presence a question she could not answer. Mara clenched her fists, reminding herself that she was not unaccustomed to solitude, and that strangers always brought risks in equal measure to opportunities. Yet, as the minutes stretched on, she realized she had begun to study him in return. His eyes were steady, unflinching but not unkind. The air around them felt charged, the dust hanging thick as if the land itself were holding its breath. Slowly, the tallest man straightened and nodded toward her. "It's getting colder," he said, voice low. "We can make camp here for the night if it's all right with you." Mara's throat tightened. She had spent so long protecting herself from the intrusion of others that even the idea of letting 5 men settle near her home filled her with anxiety. Still, something in their posture, their calm approach, made her hesitate less in refusing than she had expected. The young rider, sensing her inner debate, stepped forward, hands visible, voice careful. "I don't mean to impose," he said. I'd like to stay a while if you'll let me. I'm not here to cause trouble." His words were tentative, but there was a sincerity to them that Mara could not deny. And though she tried to ignore it, a part of her wondered whether this intrusion could also be the spark of something she had long believed impossible: connection, companionship, even the faint hope of life beyond mere survival. The dusk deepened into violet shadows across the plain, and the stillness of her long-held solitude was broken, replaced by the subtle weight of choice and the uncertain promise that the night might bring more than just darkness. Will Mara allow the young man to stay, or will she insist on protecting her solitude at all costs? Night fell like a heavy blanket over the desert, transforming the dusty plain into a realm of muted shadows and whispering wind. Mara stood in the doorway of her shack, the faint glow of a single lantern casting long, flickering patterns across the weathered boards. Her heart still raced from the confrontation of choice she had faced earlier. The 5 strangers had approached with firewood. Yes, but they had also brought the weight of uncertainty, the intrusion of lives she had not invited. Around the campfire, the riders moved quietly, stacking logs, adjusting blankets, their movements careful and respectful of the fragile boundary she had maintained for so long. She studied them from the doorway, measuring each breath, each glance, each subtle motion. The young man, he had not yet spoken more than a few polite words, remained seated slightly apart from the others, his posture relaxed but attentive, eyes tracing her silhouette with a patient intensity that both unnerved and intrigued her. Mara reminded herself that solitude had been her fortress, the only protection against the chaotic world she had left behind. Yet now she found herself questioning the solidity of that fortress. Could one human presence disrupt 13 years of isolation? Or could it perhaps bring a measure of life she had long believed unattainable? The crackle of the fire punctuated the silence, sparks drifting into the night sky, stars pricking the darkness with faint, cold light. She considered the risk, the possibility of deceit, the chance that one of these men carried intentions she could not yet foresee. But as she watched the young man quietly offer a log to an older companion and then glance toward her, she felt something unfamiliar stir, a cautious sense of curiosity, the faint pulse of human connection. And for the first time in more than a decade, Mara felt the dusty silence around her heart loosen, replaced by the gentle, electric tension of a night that might bring not danger, but something more: a chance at trust, at companionship, and, perhaps, if she allowed it, at hope. Will Mara trust the young man and the strangers enough to let them stay through the night, or will her caution prevail? As the first pale streaks of dawn cut across the desert, Mara felt the weight of the previous evening still pressing against her. The night had been long, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the parched earth. The riders had been careful, respectful, and despite her initial wariness, Mara had found herself observing them closely, noticing the subtle ways in which they carried themselves. The tallest man's hands, calloused yet precise, adjusting his saddle strap. Another, older and grizzled, methodically stacking remaining firewood. And the youngest, his gaze lingering not on the work but on her, careful to maintain distance yet impossibly present. She could not deny the curiosity that pricked at her, an emotion she had long buried beneath years of dust and silence. As he stepped closer, the young man spoke softly, voice just audible over the whispering wind. "I can help with the chores, if you'll let me. I don't want to intrude, but I mean no harm." Mara studied him, weighing the honesty in his tone against the natural caution that had kept her alive and independent for so long. The air was cold, carrying with it the scent of dry sage and dust, sharp against the skin. She felt her chest tighten. Solitude had been both her armor and her companion, and now it felt as though the delicate balance she had maintained was poised on the edge of disruption. Around them, the other riders finished preparing their horses, glancing occasionally toward the shack, waiting for her decision. Each second stretched, heavy with possibility. Mara realized that this choice, whether to allow them to stay, whether to trust them, was more than a decision about a single night. It was about opening a door she had kept shut for years, letting strangers into a space that had been defined by silence, and testing whether the human connection she had avoided for so long could coexist with the life she had fought to maintain. The rising sun painted the desert in soft light, illuminating every detail: the weathered boards of her shack, the dust rising in lazy swirls, the anxious, measured movements of the strangers, and the young man standing before her, offering help. And perhaps, unknowingly, the first thread of change in a life untouched for years. Will Mara finally allow the young man to help, or will her instinct to protect her solitude keep him at a distance? The morning unfolded slowly, a quiet tension woven into the bright desert light. Mara had allowed the young man to step closer, cautiously accepting his presence, though her instincts remained alert, a coiled spring ready to recoil if danger presented itself. He moved carefully, deliberately, placing a small bundle of kindling near the door of her shack, his hands steady and unthreatening. The other riders, taking their cue from him, continued their work, stacking firewood with efficiency, their movements silent against the backdrop of the desert's emptiness. Mara observed them from the doorway, noting the subtle nuances in their behavior, the way one of the older men adjusted his hat to shield his eyes from the sun, the rhythmic tapping of boots against the wooden boards, the gentle clinking of harnesses as horses shifted their weight. Despite her resolve to maintain her solitude, Mara found herself drawn into their rhythm, the precision and order of their labor oddly comforting against the unpredictability of the wild land surrounding her. The young man paused at the edge of the porch, gaze steady and unassuming, as if seeking permission rather than demanding it. Mara, feeling the first stirrings of an emotion she had long buried, an inkling of trust, allowed herself to nod slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but carrying across the dry earth. The acknowledgement, small as it was, seemed to shift the balance, easing the invisible barrier she had maintained for so long. Around them, dust rose in lazy swirls, horses snorted, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging that the fragile equilibrium between solitude and companionship had been altered. Mara's mind, usually occupied with the relentless monotony of survival, now contemplated the possibilities this intrusion brought. Perhaps these strangers were merely passing through, yet there was a lingering sense, particularly in the quiet insistence of the young man, that this encounter could mark the beginning of a change she had long denied herself, a connection she had believed impossible amid the dust and silence of her life. The sun climbed higher, illuminating every crevice and shadow, as if highlighting the delicate thread between trust and caution, offering Mara a glimpse of a world beyond her self-imposed exile. One moment, one choice at a time. Is Mara ready to let the young man stay longer, or will the fear of losing her solitude outweigh her curiosity? As the sun rose higher, burning away the pale shadows of dawn, Mara felt a cautious rhythm settle over the day. She moved outside her shack, measuring her steps carefully, aware of every sound, the shifting of horses, the scrape of boots against dry earth, the soft hum of wind through the sparse sagebrush. The strangers had proven themselves careful, respectful, And though Mara's instincts remained on alert, the tension that had gripped her during the first encounter had softened into something she could almost call curiosity. The tallest rider, whose authority had been evident since their arrival, continued to organize the firewood with methodical precision, giving no reason for suspicion. Two others tended the horses, speaking in low murmurs to each other. The rhythm of their labor, a steady counterpoint to the silence Mara had been accustomed to for so many years. And the youngest, the one who had asked to stay, lingered near the edge of the porch, careful not to impose, his eyes steady, watching her with patient attention. Mara found herself studying him in turn, noticing small, almost imperceptible gestures, the way he adjusted his hat, the tilt of his head as he observed her movements, the quiet steadiness in his posture. She realized for the first time in over a decade that her days of solitary routines could be challenged by these new lives intersecting with hers. There was a fragile potential here, a chance for trust, for connection, but Mara also understood that her solitude had been a shield, one that had protected her from disappointment, from intrusion, from the unpredictable nature of human intent. As the young man took another cautious step toward her, extending his hand to assist with a log that had rolled from the stack, she felt the tension of choice pressing on her, to allow, to engage, to risk a shift in the equilibrium she had maintained for so long. The wind picked up, stirring dust around their feet, and the plain seemed to stretch endlessly, echoing the vastness of possibilities that now lay before her. Mara's mind raced with the fragile calculation of trust versus self-preservation, a balance she had honed through years of isolation. And yet, for the first time, she found herself wondering whether embracing this small intrusion could bring something more, a flicker of warmth in a life defined by dust, silence, and careful distance. The sun climbed steadily, bathing the scene in harsh, revealing light, forcing Mara to confront the possibility that life beyond solitude was no longer an abstract idea, but a tangible choice she could make with each measured step. Will Mara begin to trust the young man fully, or will the shadows of her long isolation keep her at a distance? The afternoon sun burned hot against the weathered boards of Mara's shack, the light catching every crease, every grain in the sun-bleached wood. Time had a different rhythm out here, measured not in minutes, but in the rise and fall of the sun, the scraping of boots against dust, and the soft rustle of wind carrying fine particles across the barren land. Mara moved with deliberate caution, each step taken with the awareness of her years in solitude, a life honed into precision by necessity. The strangers worked quietly, a rhythm forming among them that was both purposeful and respectful, careful not to disturb the fragile balance Mara had maintained. The tallest of the riders had a quiet authority, a calm that radiated without words, overseeing the stacking of firewood and the tending of horses. The others followed with steady efficiency, their movements synchronized without need for direction, the sound of their work punctuating the dusty afternoon. Mara's gaze lingered on the youngest man. He approached slowly, carrying a bundle of kindling with a measured, almost reverent care, his eyes occasionally lifting to meet hers. It was a simple act, but one loaded with significance. The deliberate care he exhibited stirred feelings Mara had long suppressed. Could she allow herself to be affected, to permit a thread of trust to weave through the tightly coiled fabric of her solitude? As he placed the kindling down and stepped back slightly, Mara felt the weight of years pressing on her shoulders, the resistance of habit, and the fragile yearning for connection all at once. The desert air shimmered with heat, dust dancing in lazy columns around their feet, and in that suspended moment, the possibilities of companionship, risk, and change hung in the balance. Mara recognized that her life had been an intricate balance of independence and caution. Yet now, faced with these strangers who had entered her world with respect, patience, and quiet determination, she wondered whether the walls she had erected for protection could begin to crumble. The afternoon stretched onward, each movement deliberate, each glance exchanged, each small act of cooperation forming the threads of an unspoken understanding. For the first time in years, Mara considered the uncharted path that lay beyond her self-imposed exile, a path paved not only with dust and silence, but with the fragile, cautious promise of human connection and the uncertain, yet tantalizing, possibility of trust. Will Mara allow herself to let these strangers become a part of her world, or will she retreat into the safety of her dust and silence once more? The day had stretched long under the unrelenting sun, and Mara could feel the shift in the air as evening began its slow descent. The strangers continued their tasks with quiet diligence, their presence a constant yet non-intrusive rhythm against the harsh backdrop of the desert. The tall man oversaw the work, checking each horse, each bundle of firewood with practiced care, while the older riders moved with steady efficiency, their experience evident in every measured movement. The young man remained close to Mara, approaching with a quiet deliberation, offering his assistance in ways that respected her space. He lifted a small weathered tool and knelt near a broken fence post at the edge of the shack's yard, hands steady and precise, as though every motion were a silent question of trust. Mara watched him carefully, noting the care in his movements, the way he avoided stepping on the scattered stones, and the soft gaze he directed toward her without seeking acknowledgement. Dust swirled in lazy spirals around them, catching the golden light and painting the plain in shifting patterns. Mara felt her chest tighten, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity settling over her like the late afternoon heat. For years, her life had been governed by routines, solitude, and the relentless measure of survival in a world that had shown her little mercy. Yet now, in the presence of these strangers who moved quietly, respectfully, and with a subtle patience, she felt the fragile possibility of change. The wind stirred, whispering across the cracked earth, carrying with it the scent of dry sage and dust. And Mara recognized that the walls she had built around herself, walls of caution, solitude, and silence, were beginning to shift. Each act of cooperation, each careful gesture, was a small thread weaving her world closer to theirs, pulling her from the isolation she had long defended and hinting at the potential for connection, trust, and the first real sense of life beyond mere survival. The sun continued its slow descent, casting elongated shadows that stretched like silent witnesses to the unspoken transformation, and Mara, standing at the threshold of her shack, felt the first stirrings of a future she had not dared imagine. As the sun sank toward the horizon, casting deep orange and crimson across the vast barren plain, Mara felt a subtle shift within herself, a quiet stirring that had not been present in years of solitude. The strangers moved with silent precision, each one absorbed in their tasks, yet conscious of her presence. The tallest rider, always deliberate and measured, oversaw the stacking of the firewood and the care of their horses with a steady calm that seemed to echo across the desert. The older men worked with practiced efficiency, their movements almost ritualistic, as though every action reinforced a sense of order in an otherwise chaotic world. The young man, however, remained focused on Mara, approaching her with careful, intentional steps, a small wooden board held gently in his hands. He knelt to place it near the leaning section of fence that had long threatened to collapse, eyes briefly lifting to hers with an unspoken question of permission. Mara's fingers itched to gesture or speak, but she remained still, studying the precise care in his motions and the quiet respect that emanated from his every gesture. Dust lifted, in lazy spirals around them, catching the last rays of the sun and painting the scene with streaks of gold and shadow. The wind whispered through the cracked earth and dry sagebrush, carrying with it the scent of heat, dust, and distant wildflowers clinging stubbornly to life in the unforgiving terrain. Mara realized that this evening, like so many before, could have ended in the solitary stillness she had long called her own. Yet here they were, 5 strangers whose presence had been gentle but deliberate, who had intruded into her world not with force but with patience, respect, and the subtle promise of companionship. The young man finished setting the wooden board and stepped back slightly, giving her space, and in that measured pause, Mara felt something fragile yet undeniable, a thread of trust, the faintest glimmer of connection, and the realization that her dust and silence were no longer absolute. The horizon darkened, the sun dipping behind jagged rock formations, and with each passing moment, Mara's fortress of solitude felt increasingly permeable, the once unyielding walls of dust and silence beginning to bend under the gentle persistence of human presence. Twilight settled over the desert, draping Mara's world in deep purples and muted reds, the first stars twinkling faintly in the vast sky above. The day's labor had ended, and the 5 strangers had finished tending their horses and stacking. The last of the firewood, their movements now still, almost reverent, as if acknowledging the fragile transformation that had taken place. Mara stood in the doorway of her shack, shoulders tense but her gaze calm, eyes tracing the outlines of those who had, over the course of hours, crossed into the world she had maintained with such careful solitude. The young man stepped toward her slowly, each movement deliberate yet unthreatening, hands empty, posture open and sincere. He stopped a few feet away, giving her the space she needed, the soft wind carrying dust in lazy spiraling columns that caught the last remnants of light. Mara's mind, home for years on caution and isolation, wrestled with unfamiliar sensations, a cautious curiosity, a stirring sense of trust, and a quiet wonder at the possibility of connection. For so long, the plane had been hers alone, every breath, every step, every grain of dust under her control. Now, with these strangers in her midst, she felt the first real impression that life could extend beyond the rigid boundaries she had created, that human presence could bring warmth instead of danger, companionship instead of intrusion. She studied the young man's steady eyes, the subtle patience in his stance, the gentle way he respected her boundaries, and something within her shifted. The barriers of dust and silence that had defined her existence began to dissolve, replaced by a cautious yet undeniable recognition that she was capable of allowing someone into the life she had long kept hermetically sealed. The others, standing quietly by their horses, seemed almost to give space to this silent negotiation, their presence reinforcing the fragile safety Mara had allowed herself to extend. As stars emerged, tiny points of cold light in the vast night sky, Mara felt the weight of solitude lift slightly, replaced by the possibility of trust, the promise of connection, and the dawning realization that the desert, once a symbol of isolation, could now hold moments of warmth, human presence, and quiet companionship. At last, Mara took a measured breath, stepping a small distance forward, signaling the first acceptance of this new chapter in her life, and the dust and silence that had defined her for so long began to transform under the gentle persistence of understanding, patience, and care.